Obviously, the whole purpose of the Oktane conference is to talk about ways you can leverage Okta's capabilities to succeed in safeguarding your sensitive systems and reducing IT friction with internal employees and customers. But this is going to be a little bit different. We're going to focus on your personal success as IT leaders. And so my intention over the next 45 minutes is to talk about some industry trends and share some personal learnings, which I hope will enable you as an IT professional and your teams to be more impactful and hopefully advance your careers. The objectives for today are simultaneously incredibly ambitious, but also quite modest. So the ambitious goal is to share some observations, insights, and suggestions that will improve your leadership capabilities and hopefully lead to career advancement over time. The second and more modest goal is that you can take away one thing we talk about, and when you return to your offices later this week or first thing next week, you can either start doing, stop doing, or maybe do something you're already doing with a little bit more intent and vigor and energy. So you're all enrolled as members of the One Idea Club for the next 45 minutes. There's a safe harbor statement, which I didn't realize was going to be inserted here, but I have my own safe harbor statement in a moment, which is on this slide. So, as my wife would say, why would they want to listen to you talk for 45 minutes? And the rationale for that is shown here. I am a 7-time CIO, and the organizations where I've had the good fortune to lead IT teams are shown in the 2 rows on the top, and some of my more formative career experiences earlier in time are shown there at the bottom. And I've had the good fortune to work in companies that offered very different products and services, that had very different business models, different kinds of customers and clients, and operated in very different geographies. But in addition to my own direct experience, I've had the good fortune to build a fairly extensive network of colleagues, other CIOs that similarly have a broad, diverse set of experiences. And so some of the learnings I'm going to share with you today are based on what I've learned from them as well. Now, my safe harbor statement appears at the bottom of this particular slide. And I would be the first to admit that every organization has a unique set of politics and personalities and culture, in addition to its own way of doing business. And so whatever the underlying business model is that IT is supporting, it's undoubtedly been optimized and adapted to the particular products and services, as well as the idiosyncratic desires of the customers that make almost every organization unique to one extent or another. And then finally, the third dimension are the business challenges and opportunities that organizations face. So I don't want to suggest that everything that I'll share with you today is universally applicable in your organizations. But after having been a CIO 7 times, I think there's enough commonality in the way things operate that you'll all be able to take away a couple of ideas from this conversation. So what are we going to talk about today? Process management within IT. Now, I can't believe that people in the audience have not been exposed to the mantra that management consultants like to use around people, process, and technology. So people, process, and technology are talked about almost inevitably, both as a set of criteria, if you will, or a set of foundational pillars to gauge organizational effectiveness. And or consultants are frequently brought in if there's some kind of a business transformation initiative that's underway, and they'll specifically look at, what kind of new people and skills are you going to need, what kind of processes will you need to become proficient at, and then what set of tools will these individuals need to achieve the business outcomes that you're striving to achieve. The management consultants also would invariably tell you, people are the most important dimension of this kind of a 3-pronged model. Process is essential, and then technology, the tools play a supporting role in the achievement of those business outcomes. As technologists, we might have a different set of priorities. We might say, gee, if we can go out and find some kind of a new system, application, tool, or database that's making innovative use of some hot new technology like blockchain or IoT or machine learning, that the technology will be so revolutionary that it'll effectively have a seismic impact on the business and allow us to do some bigger, better things going forward. But whether you like the hierarchy of people, process, and technology, or you like the hierarchy of technology, process, and people, everybody has to begrudgingly admit that process management, both the development and definition of processes and then enforcing them on a consistent basis, is important to organizational success. Now, I'm somewhat heartened by the size of the audience that's here, because I don't think that, intuitively, IT folks generally wake up in the morning, looking forward to going to meetings during the day, to talk about process management or process definition. You know, I don't know if you get charged up because there's a meeting where we're going to review the next draft of our problem management process and look at comments people have submitted and get something that we can publish going forward. Or a similar kind of a session around SLA performance, around maybe capacity management in your data centers. I don't think that you know, enervates people when they climb out of bed in the morning. And in fact, to underscore the general ambivalence that most IT people have about process, I'm going to kick us off with a quote from Steve Jobs, who famously said, "It's much more fun to be a pirate than it is to join the Navy." And for those of you that need a translation, what that means is it's a lot more fun to creatively make things up as you go along, fly by the seat of your pants, pull victory out of the jaws of defeat, and then receive, you know, commendations from everybody in the business that somehow, you know, you personally or some small team of people demonstrated the personal heroics that allowed the impossible to be accomplished. And I would also suspect many of us in the audience, including myself, have benefited from a career point of perspective by doing that occasionally, but it's equally obvious that it's not a sustainable source of success you know, going forward. It certainly doesn't scale as organizations get larger. Now, I would be the last to suggest that you know, IT processes or process management IT is some kind of a new fad or focus area. And in fact, our industry has developed reference models in the past. Probably one of the most famous models is the IT infrastructure library. Initial work was done on this by some folks in the United Kingdom back in the late 80s and early 90s, and it's gone through several iterations over time. The most recent, I should say most recent, the most widely distributed version is IDLE v3, which I believe was published in 2007. Another popular framework, which I'm not going to display, is the COBIT framework, Control Objectives for IT, that you may have heard of. The most recent version of that was published in 2012. Get a little echo here. When you think back, these different reference models are, at this point in time, almost 30 years old. And think about the world that existed back as people thought about, you know, processes in IT 30 years ago versus today. So in that era, and again, they've been updated. I'm not claiming that they haven't changed over time, but they come from an era in which cloud computing was nascent at best. Security and regulatory concerns were far more modest than they are today. DevOps didn't exist. An IT person wouldn't have known what DevOps even stood for, you know, in the early 2000s. And the use of mobile devices and the multiple access points that we have to gain access to systems and databases, et cetera, are far more diverse today than they were back then. So the premise of this talk is to say, let's take a look at these frameworks, and I'm not suggesting that they need to be blown up or overhauled, but some of these concepts that were developed in the past really need to be modified, adapted, and changed when we think about the way they should be executed today in the world that we find ourselves. And so that's going to be kind of the focus of this conversation. Now, how many of you have heard of a book called The Lean Startup by Eric Ries? A popular book. Okay, good. So the definition of a lean product, which is a very popular concept, certainly here in Silicon Valley, is that it's the most pared down version of a product that can actually be released, and it has three key characteristics. It actually generates some kind of value and is adopted by somebody. The early adopters maintain their use of it over some period of time, and then the product itself becomes a platform for feedback about the features and capabilities that the users want. So it's kind of a pull model. So the users are coming back to the product developers and saying, it would be great if this thing could do, you know, the next thing. And although this concept was really developed and popularized in the startup community, and certainly evangelized by a lot of the venture capital firms that are here in the Valley, it's equally applicable to initiatives that would occur in a Fortune 500 company around things like developing a mobile application, let's say, or a partner portal, or a mobile application, you know, something like that. So, or an e-commerce platform, I was going to say. So this concept of the minimum viable product, you know, is well established at this point in time, and I fully intend to plagiarize this in our conversation about process development, and I want to urge you to think about minimum viable processes within your organization. Now, one of the firms that I joined several years ago, I was new to the company, and I reported to the chief operating officer. And our revenues were in excess of $10 billion a year. We had, 7,000 employees or 8,000 employees. And she said, I just want to warn you, as you kind of learn the company and you wander around and talk to different functional groups, it's a kind of a schizophrenic experience because there's parts of the company where the operational processes we use to drive the business are incredibly sophisticated and probably state of the art. And she said, and you can go talk to those people, and then the same day in the afternoon, you can stumble into other functional groups that are basically black holes when it comes to process. I mean, you'd think they represent the way a company would operate if it had 200 employees and was making $50 million a year. And she says it's somewhat unpredictable. You kind of wander around and find these huge holes in the organization in terms of process sophistication, and they contrast with the others that are far more sophisticated. And I think her observation, is equally applicable to IT organizations. And you almost inevitably have a set of processes. They may be your project management processes, they may be your financial management processes, which somehow just seem to take too much time and effort and have too much administrative overhead for the amount of benefit that they're actually generating. And then you can wander into critical areas. Maybe it has to do with the way you're managing capacity across some kind of a hybrid environment, hybrid cloud environment, that are effectively uncontrolled for all intents and purposes. So that kind of schizophrenia, I think, definitely applies to IT organizations. And finding the balance is critical, to try to find the balance between the black hole where everything is ad hoc and everything is seat of the pants, and the other end of the spectrum where frankly you have an over-engineered process that exceeds both the needs of the business and the skills of the IT staff. Now the key characteristics of what I'm referring to as a minimum viable process are somewhat similar to what we saw in the previous chart regarding products. So that minimum viable process, delivers benefits in terms of organizational performance and productivity in the eyes of its stakeholders, and that's important. Not just the people that are executing the process. They may say, this is much more efficient, but the people who are benefiting from it as well need to perceive some form of value. It has to be suited to the skills and capacity of the IT staff. And then finally, just like the MVP for the product, it needs to serve as a kind of a feedback loop to help expand or trim the actual procedural dimensions of the process that's been established and is being implemented throughout the organization. I've purposely selected the photo icon here of a bonsai gardener who's clipping away at a small tree, because in my personal experience, a lot of times processes are initially defined and implemented with a lot of good intentions, and they can kind of grow, unobtrusively over time, and they start to get extended to cover a variety of edge cases. And over time, the more the edge cases are incorporated into the way the process works, the administrative burden goes up, and then that's when people start scratching their heads like, why do we have to do this? Because the benefit associated with it is so marginal. That same company that I mentioned before had, when I arrived on the scene, an extremely sophisticated set of project management practices. My predecessor had come from the airline industry, and he had led a large, several thousand software engineering team that had developed a reservation system for one of the major airlines. And so when he first arrived, again, preceding me, he had installed some very elaborate project management practices. There were all kinds of documents that were supposed to be prepared and reviewed by IT and the business. There were all kinds of meetings that were supposed to take place on a regular basis. And the first thing that was obvious was more than half of what was supposed to happen never happened. I mean, it was too sophisticated for the needs of the business. So one of my first initiatives on the job was to, frankly, dumb down and simplify the way we were running our projects. And I failed, because I didn't really simplify them enough. And I kind of tried to honor what my predecessor had done, but it became apparent after 90 or 120 days that we needed a second round of simplification, because we were still promising to do things that we just never found the time or energy to get around to do. So I went back to the COO, and I said, listen, I kind of goofed. I should have done a better job at this, but unfortunately we're going to go through one more of these revisions, and then we'll have to explain it to everybody like how this is going to work going forward. She said, well, don't worry about that. She said, I'm not surprised. So my predecessor's name was David. And she said, when David came, he thought like he was preparing a banquet, like a state dinner for the Queen of England, visiting the White House. And so, we had this elaborate chinaware and glassware and utensils and everything. And he didn't realize we were just a bunch of hillbillies that didn't know the difference between a fork and a spoon. So it doesn't surprise me that you're going to have to go back and, get us back into our envelope of what's realistic for us to be able to do. And I thought that was actually a very apt analogy for the situation that I found myself in. Now, for the remainder of this conversation, I am going to focus on the processes that are shown in the crystal ball. So this is my personal view going forward, reflecting on the reference models that I mentioned before, about the processes that we really need to think about within IT that need to be modified to prepare for the decade ahead, as well as prioritized. I think these are some of the more critical ones that we all face to be successful in the future. The competencies that are shown here on the base of the crystal ball are core competencies that will always exist. IT will always need to be able to manage its vendors, control its finances, and deliver projects on time and on budget. So I'm not suggesting that those have lost their significance. We won't have time to talk about all 9 of the processes that are shown on that slide, but we will focus on the 5 that are here. And so I tell you that we're down to about a half hour. What we're going to do the next half hour is kind of take a cruise line tour, and we're going to come to different ports of call and stop at each one of these processes, and I'm going to share some observations with you, but with the time available, we won't really be able to go into great detail on any single one. The first I want to talk about is service management. Now, service management is a pretty broad term, and it can be applied in many different contexts, but specifically here, I'm using it to refer to the way in which IT supports the FTEs in every corporation, providing them with the IT resources and support that they need to be able to do their jobs. Sometimes I call this the quartermaster function. New employee comes in, they get equipped with the hardware they need, the software system access that they need, support for phones. They have to have somebody they can go to with questions as they run into problems, et cetera. So there are 4 competencies that are shown here that reflect IT's ability to fulfill requests, resolve incidents that end users encounter, do the analysis to understand what are the systemic problems that are giving rise to those incidents, and then put changes into production environments, either software or hardware production environments, in a predictable, consistent way that doesn't disrupt the business to resolve the systemic problems. So think of this as sort of the basic blocking and tackling that every IT organization is required to perform. And think of this as the core competencies that really will define the perceptions that 90% of the employees have about both the credibility, and the effectiveness of the IT function, because this is their moment of engagement with IT. Senior executives will be treated to VIP service, and so their personal productivity needs will be well taken care of, and they'll sort of blithely assume that, gee, everybody else must sort of get the same kind of service, so things must kind of be okay, which of course is blatantly not the case, whatsoever. They're judging the effectiveness of the function on the basis of its ability to partner with different functional groups and actually deliver, major enhancements or drive strategic initiatives that are either revenue-bearing or cost reduction type initiatives. But that's the other 10%. The vast majority of employees are really going to measure or develop their perceptions about IT based on what you see here. Let me chat for a minute about the 3 critical dimensions of a service encounter with an end user. First is technical competence. As you all know, nothing gives an end user a colder chill that after a 5-minute explanation to somebody in IT about what the problem is they've encountered, they're told, why don't you turn off the machine and reboot it, and let's just see if it goes away, okay? So that's kind of like showing your cards early in the game, right? Because it's a giveaway, it's a tell that the person that they're dealing with probably lacks the competence to address the problem that they hit. I see people smiling, so I think they've had this conversation with IT in the past. The other equally important dimension of this is personal empathy. So I would contend you can have, the most technically effective resolution of your problem, but if it's delivered through an interaction in which the IT support person acts aloof or condescending or patronizing or short, the whole thing can fail on a soft dimension. And then the third key factor here is the factor of time, which I've tried to portray with the stopwatch. And again, you can succeed on the first 2 and fail on time. By that I mean you can bring the right technical solution, you can be hugely empathetic over the course of the conversation that leads to the resolution, but something that should take maybe 10 minutes might get dragged out over a week as IT kind of kicks the problem around internally until finally getting it to a point in the organization that can actually do something about the issue that the end user is trying to resolve. Now, what's new or different about that? So what is new or different is there are a number of machine learning technologies that are being introduced in the industry to try to deflect calls and direct contact with IT and to promote more self-service on the part of end users. And so a typical kind of a technology setup for this is there's a chat bot that interacts with the end user, tries to extract information, which activates an ML, a machine learning algorithm, to go search a knowledge database to try to offer up what the prospective solution would actually be. Now, although I'm sure this can be effective in certain situations where you have recurring, very simple tier 1 problems that are pervasive across, a large population of end users, in a large company, I think we need to be very careful about, using these on a widespread basis, because when you think about those 3 dimensions, they could potentially undermine all 3 dimensions of the moment of engagement. So the first dimension that gets compromised potentially is personal empathy, because I don't think the chatbot's been implemented yet that can, empathize across all forms of human beings that are going to want to talk to IT. The second is technical competence, and the problem there is unless the knowledge database is robust enough to really address the needs of the user, this is kind of like having a one-way conversation in a box canyon with yourself. And that leads to the time dimension. Nothing is more frustrating than to play the game with the chatbot, not be able to get the problem resolved, and then have it escalated up into some human interaction, and the user feels like they've got to start the conversation all over again from the beginning. So a word of warning here is these are the core competencies that will be judged by the majority of our colleagues in our companies. And although these new tools can be effective, I would personally rather see them applied to more proactively find patterns in terms of the kinds of requests that are coming into IT from different functional groups and different geographies, or to look at the kind of incidents that are being raised, which may give early warning signals about more systemic problems that IT needs to go chase. So I think to motivate more proactive activities on the part of IT, these ML tools can be extremely helpful, but beware about tampering with those 3 key dimensions of dealing with your end users. Process number 2, application development and maintenance. So obviously the big change in the world here is many of us had application portfolios in the past that were all in the data center. Either they were homegrown applications or we'd gone out and licensed software and we were running it on our own servers. The world has changed significantly. Most companies today have a SaaS-first strategy. Most of the new business applications are cloud tools. And in point of fact, most organizations have hybrid portfolios now that have a little bit of both. Now, whether you have a SaaS-dominated portfolio or an on-prem dominated portfolio, the work streams that come into the ADM support teams is pretty much the same. You've got bugs that require production support. You have enhancements that have been requested by the business. You have strategic projects that are going to extend or add on to some of the systems that you have today. And there'll be a series of more minor administrative tasks like generating reports or cleaning databases or changing user access to certain applications. So all of those requests and needs flow through some kind of an intake and execution process, and then changes are delivered to the business over there on the right-hand side. Now, the blocking and tackling processes that support ADM are reflected by the horizontal bars on the top and bottom of the diagram here. So on the bottom, obviously, IT has to understand its own capacity. You can only sign up for so much work that's going to get done based on the kind of throughput that you've been able to demonstrate to yourself in the past. Testing is incredibly important to make sure that the changes that are going into production are of high quality, and then that introduction of new capabilities has to be done through a very practiced change and release management kind of model. So again, regardless of the mix of SaaS and on-prem tools that you have, the general schematics of this process remain the same. What has changed is the introduction of Agile techniques in supporting business applications. Now remember that Agile was never developed initially to support business applications. It was made to build new software capabilities. Over time, it has become the more prominent and prevalent way of supporting business applications, and it has a number of important pluses, but has some minuses as well. So let me start with the positive. So it can definitely improve IT productivity. It's a fact of life that human beings, including myself, can do a lot better job of predicting what I can get done in the next 2 weeks than predicting what I can get done in the next 2 months or the next 2 quarters. And so in a Scrum cycle that may be 1 week in duration or 2 weeks in duration or 3 weeks in duration, the surety that the results that IT is signing up for will actually materialize is much, much higher through the use of Scrum practices that are an inherent part of Agile. A nice side outcome of those shorter delivery cycles is greater business involvement on a more consistent basis, right? So the business will continue to help prioritize what's going to happen in each cycle, and we'll probably have to get involved in some form of user testing before some of these changes can actually be put in production. So that conversation with the business becomes much more of a continuous and ongoing kind of phenomena rather than one in which IT takes some problems and goes off into its cave and brings results out 6 weeks later or 8 weeks later and tries to re-engage with the business when they've gotten distracted on some other set of priorities that they want to go chase. The third is Agile provides a unique capability to maintain a sustained focus on reducing technical debt. So again, this is a feature of Agile that comes directly out of the software engineering practices in which a certain amount of labor effort in each Scrum cycle is reserved to chip away at tech debt over time. And it's very important that this get incorporated into the way in which Agile is adopted or adapted to support business app portfolios. All too often it's kind of given away and assumed just magically happened. Now, if you recall in the old days when you had licensed software, a lot of the tech debt was reduced through version upgrades by the vendors. So there could be some kind of a vendor tool that you have, and you could be running on version 5.3, and you could have skipped a whole bunch of intermediate dot releases and version upgrades, and then you just kind of do this massive lift and take yourself up to 7.4. And in the course of doing that, you would have retired a significant amount of technical debt. But you would have dug a pretty deep hole for yourself probably before you went through that version upgrade. Well, in a way, you don't have that luxury with a SaaS tool because new functionality is being introduced continuously by the vendor, and you will be out there continuously integrating new capabilities from one app to another, introducing potential customizations, introducing custom fields, objects, et cetera. And the beauty of Agile, when it's strictly adopted in the sense it was intended, is you have this ability to make tech debt reduction a much more regular and ongoing activity. We're going to talk more about tech debt in a minute. And then finally, and this one might surprise you, Agile actually provides a way of going back and asking for more budget money. And the reason that is if, let's say you have 10 people in your apps team that is supporting the Salesforce platform and a lot of the associated Salesforce applications. And over time, you can demonstrate the productivity of that 10-person team. You can be very realistic if the team's activities are properly metricized at what's a realistic expectation of what they can actually produce. If in fact the business is generating in every Scrum cycle more work than the team will ever be able to get around to do, then it's inherently obvious that business priorities are not going to be served. And in fact, we're going to have priority debates forever with a lot of bruised feelings and frankly, the problem that some things that are probably important to get around to do are just constantly being slipped out into the future and never are actually getting addressed. So in my personal experience, it's much easier to come back to a functional leader and say, hey, these 10 people, if you want all this stuff done that your people keep begging for all the time, and you don't want to see this backlog kind of grow into infinity, you need to partner with me, and we got to go to the CFO, and I need some more people. Because you can see what I can actually accomplish, but we're never going to get our head above water at the rate we're actually going. The minuses. So IT organizations need to develop new muscles about how to deconstruct work streams into a series of bite-sized activities that can be performed on those 2-week kind of cycles. And that sounds simple, but if any of you have made the transition to this kind of model, it takes practice. It's not something that happens overnight. It can require more explicit organizational roles than you've had in the past. So if you think again about that, maybe that 10-person team that's supporting the Salesforce platform, there are probably 20 other SaaS tools that are plugged into that platform that collectively are delivering a set of features and functions that support different business processes in your sales and marketing and customer support organizations, okay? So actually the person who's responsible for the ecosystem of Salesforce and the other 20 apps is a product manager who's delivering a feature set out into these business functions and needs to start thinking of themselves in that context as opposed to just supporting 21 different applications. And to do that effectively, you need a dedicated solution architect that understands the complexities about how that ecosystem is operating. And then you need somebody that's going to crack the whip to make sure that work is being done on an appropriate basis, and that person is the Scrum Master. There's some nuances in applying Agile to the different work streams that we talked about. Now, some of those nuances relate to the various platforms that are being supported. Some, like Salesforce, are very development intensive, and the more development intensive that the platform is, the more it lends itself to Agile management practices. Others are really just configuration, are changed through various configurations, like a Workday HR system. And so, sometimes scheduling configuration changes through a set of JIRAs that are being planned on multiple cycles may actually create more overhead than it's worth. And the same comment can apply to administrative tasks. So this can be a problem. Let's say there's somebody over in HR that wants this report generated, and it's incredibly critical for the next merit cycle, and they need it in their hands today. Well, that doesn't sound like a hugely important, activity. And it's probably something that can be done without opening a JIRA. It can be done almost like a service ticket that's come into a desk of some type or another. And so you have to be careful that you're not frustrating your end users if there's some important to them, but relatively simple administrative tasks that need to be performed that don't necessarily lend themselves to this cyclical Scrum practice. Third process, we're going to talk about security culture. Now, it's inconceivable to me that as IT professionals, you are all not familiar with what it takes to put together a cybersecurity program. So the key elements of a cybersecurity program are shown here. The ranking information security executive, the CISO or whoever, will establish a set of policies. Controls are put in place to ensure that those policies are actually implemented. The controls themselves beget a series of work rules and procedures. Tools are introduced to both implement the controls and monitor their adherence. And then dedicated staff is involved in actually ensuring the safeguards are in place and measuring their effectiveness. These are necessary but not sufficient conditions for a true security culture. And there are such things as security cultures. Now, what is security culture? I think one of the speakers this morning from one of the, at the keynote, came from a wealth management firm. And I've visited wealth management firms. And believe me, everybody in that firm totally understands information security because basically the firm would go belly up and they'd be out of jobs if the investment holdings of some of their more senior people, their customers, became public knowledge. I visited a gaming company in Chicago in the last month, and they had the same paranoia about the gambling histories of some of the casino clients becoming a matter of public knowledge. They felt that if that were ever to happen, effectively they'd go out of business. I mean, people would stop coming to the casinos, particularly their more wealthy customers. So what's the difference between a program and a culture? So in a culture, there's enterprise-wide awareness about what these risks actually are. People are educated and understand the need for safeguards that they might scoff at otherwise. And at the bottom here, the other thing that happens is security concerns surface in a wide range of ordinary business conversations. So it could be a strategic initiative, an IT project that's getting off the ground. It could be the annual budgeting cycle. It could even be a quarterly business review in some functional area. But the potential security vulnerabilities or issues or concerns, keep surfacing in these conversations over time. Now, if you look at most modern corporations, I'm going to make up a hypothetical company here. So let's say we had 10,000 people in a company. It wouldn't be unreasonable to think that their information security staff might be 200 people. Okay, if it's financial services or maybe if they're doing pharmaceutical R&D, maybe it's more. But the presumption is that there's some group of people, 200, 300, 400, within that 10,000 person company that can keep everybody else out of trouble. Like they're smart enough, we've given them the tools, we've got these other 9,000 plus people wandering around potentially doing things that could get us in trouble, but somehow this small team is going to actually ensure that that doesn't happen. And as kind of fallacious as that is obviously it sounds, when I just say it out loud, the same is true in most IT shops. So if you had a 400-person IT organization with 20 people in InfoSec, the presumption is those 20 people will take care of the problem, and far forbid that they would come out of their corner of the organization and actually ask other people to do things on their behalf, that might be required to produce additional assurances about the safeguarding of information. So most of the times when that outreach occurs, it's actually resisted by the people in other parts of IT. So I think as important as it is for enterprises to develop this kind of culture, there's a unique opportunity in IT to kind of model those behaviors and lead the way and really be an example to the rest of the organization. And we should be. I mean, we are on the front lines of this kind of issue every day. So I'm highlighting here kind of 5 steps or 5 ways of attacking the problem. So one is to teach awareness, make sure people understand, who are our threat actors? Do we have a bunch of hackers that want to destroy our brand reputation? Do we have criminals that want access to our data so they can monetize it on the dark web? Are there political nation states that want to use us to make a statement in some political fashion? Where are the bad guys and where are they coming from? How are they going to get in the door? What are the vulnerabilities that we have? Now, I have done this in the past, and I would encourage you to consider it. I put great credence in risk registers. So risk registers are nothing more than a prioritized list of risks. I think there's a lot of benefit from getting the whole organization to participate forming and maintaining a risk register. You can gamify this a little bit and hand out rewards or awards to people that have ferreted out some of the vulnerabilities that nobody else has thought of. You know, a typical vulnerability might be, hey, we inherited through an acquisition a server on our corporate network that's running an operating system that hasn't been patched since 2003. Like, does anybody know that? The guys down in the trenches, they know that. Like, they're astounded that nobody can just like live day to day and let that go on, you know, year after year after year. I'm getting a lot of grins on this one too. So, so the register can help identify those. And again, it can become a funding vehicle. And again, I've had the good fortune to go to my CFO and say, here's the register, you gave me budget, I was able to knock off a bunch of stuff, but I still got some things that keep me up at night, and if you've got some money left in the quarter, there's another 5 things on here that I can kill, you know, if you can shake a little more money from the tree for me, and I have had some success at that in the past. Okay, talking about security issues is a great way to raise awareness. A former colleague of mine had a saying which I've used over and over again, and he used to love to say, he said, you know, what interests my boss fascinates me. And it is true that people will take cues from your interests. And if you ask even naive questions about the management of PII information or whether some kind of a new liability is being created through a particular project or an activity, you'd be surprised at the domino effect that that'll have. The same concerns will get discussed without you in the room because people want to be ready to answer those questions the next time you raise one and, you know, become more pervasive concern of the organization. Measuring the actual implementation of safeguards, you know, the extent to which they've been put in place, as well as their effectiveness is obviously important. And then I think this fifth dimension of personalize is one that we don't take enough advantage of. It's almost like, you know, we have schizophrenic behaviors. We have one set of human behavior about when you go home at night and you get on your own laptop and, you know, you do crazy things like open emails that you shouldn't open or expose financial information or password credentials because it's easy to do, that provide family members or friends access to, you know, important personal information, et cetera. And I think a way to educate people about what would be considered good behaviors in the workplace is to try to school them about what they shouldn't be doing when they go home. Because now it's personal. I mean, I want to help you protect yourself from what can actually happen, you know, when these cookies get implanted or whether, you know, you provide your social security number. You know, it's easy to scan an email message and find a social security number. So there are dimensions of behavior that happen every day as consumers that if people were better informed, they would stop doing, and those stop doing behaviors would find their way over into the workplace as well. And that vehicle of personalizing the consequences is probably far more effective than having sacked bag lunches at work or some kind of, you know, video presentation that they're all required to sit through for 20 minutes as far as getting the point across. So again, as I leave this, I just want to again make the point, IT can really be a leader in this regard and demonstrate and you know, exhibit to the rest of the company the way security concerns should really be managed and thought of on a more pervasive cultural wide manner. Okay, I promised you a little bit more about tech debt. I don't think I have to lecture this crowd about the evils of tech debt, but some of the more prominent ones are listed there on your left. You know, obviously, tech debt can lead to huge distractions in terms of management time, staff time, budget dollars that could be better used elsewhere. As debt accumulates over time, it can increase operational risks. I'm not sure if it comes across in the graphic, but what I tried to do in the background is find a picture of barnacles. I think barnacles are a perfect analogy for technical debt. I did a little homework on barnacles when I was doing my web surfing for this presentation, and I was astounded to find out that if barnacles grow on the hulls of ships for an extended period of time, 20 or 30% of the fuel on the ship is being used to do nothing but overcome the drag being created by the barnacles. And I thought, you know, like, I've been to that movie. I think there are a lot of IT organizations where we spend like 20 or 30% of our time kind of getting nowhere from a business point of view, just trying to keep the ship afloat. The proposed solution for attacking tech debt, and a couple dimensions of that here, this may not be exhaustive. I think it's important to start to have dedicated headcount for the hygiene of the platform itself. So we've actually done this at Okta. We have a platform engineer for Salesforce. We've used Salesforce for the 10 years of the existence of the company. We've probably committed every sin you can on that platform. We've had contractors and consultants come in and install customized application packages. We've added objects and fields that some people couldn't even tell you what that field is for, that's kind of sitting out there. And so for the first time, we've got somebody who's, really like the doctor of Salesforce and has a small team and some dedicated cycles to try to trim back, all those bad things that we've done to ourselves over time. In the Bay Area, this is actually a pretty popular activity at the present time because many people are trying to clean up their classic versions, the legacy versions of Salesforce, to move on to Lightning, which has become the more modern, the more popular version. And so I've encountered many other CIOs that have dedicated teams that are doing this. But in this case, we've got people, we're hacking away at this, but this isn't just a one-time effort or a one-time project. This is something that we'll do in perpetuity, most likely. The other thing that's been eye-opening to me is that the engineer has come back, and first he just started to report all these positive things he was doing. I got rid of these fields, and he said, but I'm not making headway because more bad things are being added to the platform than I'm able to correct at the current point in time. So that's another issue to go deal with. I mentioned before, Agile is a great way to keep chipping away at this problem and not letting it take on titanic proportions. There's a software company you'd all be familiar with over in Pleasanton that actually put together a 32-person team for 9 months to get their platform cleaned up. That's how far the deterioration had actually occurred. So Agile, you can chip away and not let these things creep up on you over time. You can keep score in two ways. You can look at the manifestation of the debt, which I talked about, objects, packages, fields, and as well as the consequences. So page loading times or, the difficulty of the sales team being able to do work on the weekend. We would routinely have sales guys say, I'm spending like 3 hours on my Sunday just putting together a report because I'm kind of like wrestling Salesforce to the ground to get the data that I need to make my presentation. And then one of the other systemic things that you can do is become more organized in getting rid of older applications. And one of the problems with SaaS, and I know this is heresy to a point, but SaaS dominated portfolios tend to have a long tail because functional groups can go out and spend small sums of money, and add to the complexity of that ecosystem that's being built around the major platforms. And each one of those individual investments isn't that great. So it's $40,000 subscription a year, $75,000 subscription a year, depending on the size of your company. And so when you try to rationalize that kind of a portfolio, you've got to inflict a certain amount of pain on the users to get them to give something up without a whole lot of individual cost savings, which can be a difficult thing to do. But if you can manage that long tail more on a portfolio basis over a longer period of time, almost inevitably you've probably acquired other applications that do in whole or in part what some of those earlier purchases are doing. And it is possible to put together a program that will lead to some pretty significant cost savings. I've done that before in an earlier life. We called the program Get Rid of Old Stuff Sooner, which the acronym was GROSS. And so we had these buttons that used to say, like, let's get gross together, which at least got people to talk about the problem we were trying to solve. The last process I'm going to touch on today is IT governance. And this is the conversation around how do you align IT and the business. And I'm not the first person to make this observation, but Gartner, I think, dreamed this up decades ago, and it kind of gives me a chill when I even talk about aligning IT into business, because it implies there's an IT agenda for what we all want to do, and then there's a business agenda, and we're going to meet at a negotiation table, kind of like we're going to have a treaty. We'll kind of trade off some of the stuff we want to do, and we'll begrudgingly, we want to build out the data center, and you want some new business applications. Let's see if we can have a tug of war, and we'll figure out where we land in the middle, and everybody gets a little bit of what they want. So the way this kind of process manifests itself inevitably is in some kind of a governance committee, some kind of an oversight group that brings IT leaders and business leaders together to help direct what's going to happen in the future. I've been in many companies where we've had these committees, and I'm going to tell you that my batting average isn't great. Probably more than half the time they become very dysfunctional over time. And some of the symptoms of dysfunction that I've encountered personally are shown here. So although most of these kind of things start with a lot of enthusiasm and professed dedication on the part of the business folks, pretty soon you start to see these meetings get canceled. And so at the last minute, somebody will say, gee, can't make that, just send the deck out. Just distribute the deck by email, and if we have any comments, we'll get back to you on what the problem is. Or you have the meeting, and there are a lot of no-shows at the last minute. Or if you don't have no-shows, people have delegated responsibility to a subordinate one of their lieutenants. The lieutenant has no decision-making authority whatsoever, and frankly, it's not their job to go back and socialize any of the information that's being shared at the meeting either. So for all intents and purposes, that functional area is not being represented. Over time, meetings become much more ad hoc and the agendas are unpredictable. And then these kind of things, when they get out of control, you start to see excessive preparation procedures. The decks that are required to stage these conversations start to number like 100 or more slides that are being prepared. And there's a tremendous amount of pre-meeting that takes place. So let's say there's 3 initiatives that we want to talk to 5 executives about. So there'll be 15 meetings before the meeting to get them on board with what we want them to do. And of course, none of them understand IT well enough, so they're going to look at their number 2 person and say, what do you want me to do about this? Are we for this or against that? So there's another 15 meetings that have to take place. So there's going to be 30 meetings to get ready to let 5 executives come in and talk for an hour about 3 IT things. So these things kind of like, balloon over time. The way to correct this problem is, I think, pretty obvious. There's nothing very profound about this. But to be very clear in the charter for these kind of groups, what the purpose is. Are we going to make funding decisions? Maybe. Are funding decisions being made in functional groups? And this is to prioritize, who goes first. Or do we have a trust issue with IT and we want to review their SLA performance? They promised us these services, but are they really delivering as they had promised? Or are we just here to share information? Like, do all the functional leaders go to the CFO, cut side deals? Nobody knows what's really going on in IT, and we just want to get everybody in a room so they have some idea. You have to determine whether these conversations are going to be on strategic issues or tactical or both. Both the participation, the participants need to be clearly defined, as well as the rules. If we don't have a quorum, do we not have a meeting? If we can get a quorum and you're not there and we make a decision, are you going to live by the decision, et cetera? Format and frequency are important. And then probably the biggest mistake I've made in the past was to not put a sunset clause in the initial charter of these groups. So let's say with a lot of enthusiasm, you're going to launch some kind of a new governance effort in the fiscal year. And let's say for sake of argument, you're going to have a meeting, a bi-monthly meeting. So at the end of the 5th meeting, if there's a sunset clause, you say, you know what, guys, there's one more meeting left. And then we're going to stop doing this. We're not going to have any meetings next year whatsoever because we never committed to do that. Now, if you think some of what we've done is useful, we could continue to do that. If you'd like to see us do some additional things that we're not doing right now in these conversations, we can do that as well. But we're just not going to keep staging this meeting over and over again if you're not satisfied that it has some material benefit. So those are the 5 processes I wanted to touch on in the time available. I'm going to close with a quote or 2. So I don't know if you're familiar with Edward Deming. Edward Deming was an industrial engineer and a management consultant that went to Japan after World War II and was sort of the godfather of their statistical manufacturing control practices. So when you hear Six Sigma talked about, he was one of the pioneers in introducing those kind of statistical procedures into Japanese manufacturing. And some of you may be old enough to remember, the term made in Japan at one time was a very derogatory term. It implied that the product was going to fall apart, within the first couple weeks or months of use. And obviously, at some point in time, their automotive industry actually overcame ours in terms of its quality performance. So one of the favorite sayings that I like from Deming, he says, if you can't describe what you're doing as a process, then you really don't know what you're doing. It's kind of hard to argue with that. But the quote that I like the best is the following, which is that a bad process will beat a good person every time. And so this is my final call to action for you all. I suspect many of you are sitting there saying, he's got a point in a couple places here. I could go back and make things better if I followed up on 1 or 2 of the ideas that Mark has shared with us. But I have so many other things to do. I have so many other priorities. I have this major business initiative that's due in the 3rd quarter. And maybe sometime later in the year, I can focus a little bit of time and energy on following up on some of these ideas. If you do it for no other reason, do it for the mental health and morale of your own staff. Because no kidding, they see what's going wrong all the time. And they get tired after a while, beating their head against the wall, having to burn up calories through some kind of a high entropy process just to make things work on a day-to-day basis. Now, they're never going to step forward and say, let's have a process. It'd be like your kids, saying, hey, let's have a structured process about how I'm going to do my homework every night. How are we going to set this up? When am I going to, turn the TV off and put the phone down? They're not going to ask for it, but they would all be better students, if such a process was actually in place. So if I haven't persuaded you with the logic of my argument, maybe I can appeal to your emotions and just think about, all the mental health concerns that you could address by pursuing some of these ideas. Much of what I've talked about today, well, some of what I've talked about today is discussed a little more eloquently in a book that I published a couple years ago. There are copies in the back of the room. You're all welcome to take a copy with you. If you've joined me in the past and you would like to take another copy and share with a friend, I'd encourage you to do that as well. And I think I've successfully gone over time once again, which keeps me from having to answer any questions. Thank you very much.